This is Gender in Focus. I'm Elle, and each week I sit down with the president of Transfocus Consulting and all-round gender diversity genius, Kai Scott. I get to ask all the questions you've ever wanted to ask about how to make the workplace and the world a better place for trans and non-binary people. Let's get into it.
In today's episode, we unpack a common misconception about trans and non-binary people in that they're a part of a trend that is something new or unexpected. We'll explore the many dimensions of gender diversity over time and reveal a profound truth underlying all of this. Being trans or non-binary is not like fast fashion, here today and gone tomorrow. Being trans and non-binary is something that's enduring. So I'm really excited to unpack all of this with my colleague, Elle. Good morning or afternoon. I can't even remember what time it is. All of them, probably. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Fantastic. Yeah, really excited.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this one too, because it's sort of a topic of conversation that seems to be everywhere at the moment, that gender diversity is a new thing and that trans people are they just suddenly popped up and are convincing everybody else to be trans, and it's just unprecedented. And so I guess I should start with something like that, Kai. Have you just appeared out of nowhere one day to indoctrinate everybody? So sorry, that just came out.
No. It's good. It's good. Just called out. Just like, are you
Who
here?
have you been brainwashing?
Oh man. To some degree, it is quite laughable, right?
Right.
There's a seriousness, but also this is an appropriate response to that type of kind of incredulous statement.
Would you like me to start that again?
No, I love it.
Oh, you want me to keep the bit where I'm asking you if you're indoctrinating people? Okay, you do you.
Well, that's what is sometimes on people's minds is they wonder quietly. And so I think it's sometimes good to, surface things to get them out in the clear, to be able to talk about them in a forthright manner and clearly too, right? And of course, trans people did not just pop out of nowhere, myself included, and is something like, just totally new, never heard of this before. Now, I will say something about history. Unfortunately, especially when it comes to minorities, our history can be and is consistently erased. So it is understandable to some degree why people it does seem from the outside something suddenly has popped up, right?
Right.
Because we weren't talking about this, maybe 5 years ago. And now it seems to be like every other day is a news item on trans people. Like, whoa, maybe we can just like calm that one down a bit. But
they are obsessed with you.
Very much so. Very obsessed. When you look back in history or different cultures around the world, this is a very persistent, consistent thing. And it might come in different words or different practices and ways of being or whatnot. But there is a through line that connects all these different points. Now, some people may not, that history or that understanding is not available to folks or take some digging to get to, but this is something that has always been there. For myself too, in terms of my own personal story, it's, something that I heard about and, had something inside of me that just was, I couldn't explain that what people were telling me who I was not resonating. And it's only until I heard information from other trans folks that I was like, oh, this is it, right? So there's a connection there. It's not something that's kind of foisted from the outside onto people. It comes from deep within and connects to what's being shared. So that's another key thing to understand is that people aren't being indoctrinated. This is something that people finally have a relief around being able to explain an internal experience that they're having and connecting it with words or different ways of being or joining a community and whatnot. So I think that's key to understanding trend. It's not a trend in that sense.
Mm-hmm. From my own perspective of this, something that I can reflect on in hindsight now is something I was really struggling with was my gender when I was about 9 or 10. The idea that this is something that's just popped up and is new. When I really think about myself before I had any kind of knowledge of what non-binary was, or I'd never really
Mhm.
heard anything about trans people, where I'm from, it's not a super diverse area, so it's not something that I had any concept of. And yet, in hindsight, I can see how much I was struggling with that as a very young kid. So I think that's interesting that there is this kind of the perception that it's something that's new and just we're all being influenced by
Mhm.
other people.
Yeah. And I think to some degree, people don't realize this kind of quietly either suffering or being confused in silence. And they mistake that for this suddenly being more vocal or visible about it, and not realizing the decades long that somebody has been with this, right? And so that's what's not transparent to people. And, you know, we'd have to make things a lot safer for folks to feel like they could open up earlier in that process to share what's going on for them, even in the stage of where they're wondering, out loud. Uh, but given that that's not the case, and really things are getting even more dangerous for folks, I think we'll have even quieter period where it just seems like it doesn't exist when actually it is very much there. It's just kind of hidden out of sight, and again, driven by safety.
When we think about what's going on right now, especially down in the States, where we are seeing this big removal of trans people from aspects of history, such as Stonewall,
Mm,
or we're seeing book bans and the banning involving information regarding research involving trans experiences, trans identity, trans lives.
mm.
How do you think that's going to be impacting how we view trans people, and especially sort of future impacts?
It's a huge impact that we're kind of erasing large swaths of existence from public record, right? Like to the point where if somebody was interested in knowing about this segment of the population now into the past, they wouldn't have access to that information. And to even know about folks, and of course this is not the first time it's happened, right? This has also happened in different periods and different parts of the world. Nazi Germany comes to mind, where, book burnings and even burning down, really important research done by Herschel, where he was starting to understand about trans as well as sexual diversity as well. And, in a research way and documenting that. And it was just all up in smoke. So we don't have access to those one stories, but also important understanding to know. And so, of course, you have to kind of rebuild that over time. But then, it always seems to be like two steps forward and then one or more steps back, to where the general public never has a full view of trans and non binary folks, except for perhaps some brave souls that continue to speak up even when it's quite dangerous, right? Yeah, and so there's large gaps, even for trans and non-binary folks to understand our own history. We think about Two-Spirit people who, because of colonization, a lot of their nation or society or culture-specific knowledge of being Two-Spirit completely eliminated with the language being suppressed, and cultural practices. And so it's just like we have so many examples of that erasure happening. And really, it doesn't just hurt trans and non binary folks or Two Spirit folks, but actually everyone. To know that diversity exists, that it's not a scary thing, that it's a normal part of human tapestry, that we have gifts to give and also receive from others, right? It just kind of tears that fabric, very sadly and very tragically.
Hmm. With the current way that trans people are being represented in the media, how how would you say that's sort of shaping public perception overall?
Yeah, it's creating this artificial other
Hmm.
that it needs to be, yeah, avoided at all costs. Certainly, kind of driven out of somebody, that it's not their true nature. This is
Hmm.
something that they kind of just dreamt up, kind of usually in their minds overnight, like just kind of
Right.
willy nilly chosen because of whatever. I hear things like because people want attention, or because they're addicted. There's an addictive. They try to kind of liken it to being addicted to substances. Um, a whole number of explanations that people provide, and really stoking up a lot of fear about people when and then when they actually meet somebody who's trans, if they have the good fortune, um, I think a lot of it is just kind of disjointed because they're just like, "What? You're just like any other person.
Normal.
You're
Just
just
living your life.
doing you. Maybe we even like the same things." Like,
Right.
whoa, that's earth shattering. And so it just really creates a lot of distance and separation in ways that unfortunately harm so many, certainly trans and non-binary folks, because can't see ourselves in society, but certainly also for cisgender people, because anytime somebody trans comes forward, it's this like fearful moment rather than like, oh, they might be making a really good or an important point. Let me listen. No, it's like we got to tamp that down and
Mhm.
eliminate it. Yeah.
When I was first kind of thinking about my gender and whether or not I'm non-binary, I told myself quite a lot that it must be about attention or
Mhm.
something like that. I really struggled with my reasons behind it because I didn't look a certain way. And so I really struggled with that idea that, there's an ulterior reason or ulterior motive for me thinking this. And so I think that what you said about how we see ourselves and like that kind of lacking of the representation or the sort of negative representation that really alters or affects the way that trans and
Mhm.
non-binary people see themselves and understand themselves. So I wanted to ask you about that really and how framing trans issues as a trend can really affect the outcomes for
Mhm.
trans and non-binary people.
Yeah, it's such a good one, and we certainly have been talking about the impacts on cisgender people not knowing that trans and non-binary folks exist and
Mm-hmm.
pop up suddenly. But you're right that it does impact the journey that a trans or non-binary person goes on, and that it takes much longer if there's a lack of representation or lack of information about history, or even seeing oneself, being able to see oneself in current media as well. So whenever somebody says, oh, it's a trend, or another way of saying it's a fad, right? This kind of like here to for a moment and then gone, doesn't speak to how far, kind of there that present that identity is in oneself, and that when people use that type of language, it then makes them doubt themselves in the way that you described,
Mm-hmm.
right? And certainly I did too. It took me very long because I didn't want to do it for quote the wrong reasons,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
um, I wanted it to be very sure that this was an internally generated thing that and I knew that it was there all the way along, and somehow I needed to override by providing way too much proof to myself to override that kind of stereotype, right? That
Mm-hmm.
fad phase, doing it for attention. There's a very long list of things that people do. Oh, you should just try this and you should be okay. You don't have to like disrupt your whole life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Versus like, if people could accept at a much faster, then it would be that much easier to step out of from that internal realization into the external, to make that. And for me, it's so sad because people are often like really crestfallen when trans people come out to them, right? Like, oh, I didn't see it, I didn't know, why didn't you tell me sooner? So we're kind of caught between this rock and a hard place pretty consistently of like, you should have told us sooner, but that's too fast. And you're like, okay,
Yeah.
where do you want me to go? Like, and it just feels like an impossibility essentially. Um, and I think if people could be present with folks in their becoming, how much more beautiful, how much more relaxed, how much more connected people could be in that process. But unfortunately, there's just so many layers and murkiness and mess that it makes it really difficult for trans people to be themselves from when they understand that, rather than having to understand it and then be like, oh crap, okay, now there's all this other stuff, and maybe a year goes by, a decade goes by before it's like, okay, now I'm ready to take more steps.
Hmm. Can we talk about trans youth? And, trans youth is a topic of conversation everywhere at the moment in quite a
Mm-hmm.
negative way. And
Yeah.
when we're talking about framing trans people as a trend or as a fad, can you speak to what that does to trans youth and how it affects youth in particular?
Oh my goodness. My heart breaks for trans youth right now.
Hmm.
Like, just point blank. I mean, I can't even imagine. Like, it's one thing to, be kind of in the shadows trying to figure yourself out,
Hmm.
but it's quite another to try to figure yourself out and be able to express that to others
Hmm.
while the governments are actively working against you or saying all manner of really awful things. To discount or dismiss or denigrate one's becoming. Like,
Hmm.
it's such a big moment, and it's just kind of sullied by all the things that are being said, and people don't realize the depth of the piercings that they're creating with their words. Youth come in all, some are very strong and can advocate for themselves, and others, they kind of crush under that weight, and it won't be till many years later that they really share what's going on, and so people will miss out on years of somebody's life because of what's being said and done right now. And certainly the trend fad thing is often launched against trans youth specifically, because how can you know yourself? You're just with this group of people who are brainwashing you, or some community online, whatever the case may be, when in fact for many trans youth this has been going on for them, and they finally connecting with something that can understand and express that, and you know be able to share specifically what's going on, to pinpoint it,
Hmm.
which is a very exciting thing. And the fact that they want to include other people in their lives, whether it's family, parents, siblings, extended family, friends, and then their kind of main response is like, we don't believe you. Okay, like, what do you think? A youth's not going to respond very well to that. And there'll be a range of ways that that manifests, right? Some will be anger, some will be frustration, others will be quiet, others will just quietly move, like, emotionally or physically distant, So it's just a huge loss because of that, rather than being like, tell me more. I want to
Hmm.
understand. I hear you say this, and I understand this is a big moment, and I want to, like, if somebody doesn't legitimately understand, that's okay. I don't think people are expecting perfect understanding, but this dismissal is very cruel. I don't
Hmm.
think people realize how cruel it is. And I think when people could reflect on hearing that themselves, sharing a big piece of information that might help provide a bit of a bridge to understanding that, especially something very big
Hmm.
that they've kind of wrestled with for a while, and then sharing with somebody else, and they just kind of like, cast it aside. Wow.
Mm. I think there is that thing of like, if cisgender people don't understand it, it's projected so hard
Yeah.
onto trans people. But at least from my understanding and my own experience and the people that I love who are trans, it's been such a long journey to that point where you're ready to come out, that it's the one thing they really are sure of. And you don't
Yeah.
understand and you're confused, but they are not confused. And so,
Hmm.
yeah, just trying to get that understood to the wider world is a really hard thing. And like with youth, I feel like a lot of people forget how hard being a teenager is and being young
Totally.
is. You're trying to figure yourself out and work out where you fit and where you stand. And really, like, people do want to fit in. Like, we're built that way. We want to fit in.
True.
And if someone is telling you that they feel like they're not, or that something's not right, it's probably because they feel like something isn't right and something is different, or that they need to figure something else out. And it would be great if you stood with them as
Yeah.
opposed to immediately denying what they're saying because you're uncomfortable with it.
Right. Yes. So well said. Yeah, it's so important. And it doesn't mean that I have it all figured out or know what to do. It's just like standing by someone, literally just next to them, being like, let's take the steps together. And any way I can, stand up, say stuff, not say stuff, listen, like whatever it is. It's very simple. Uh, Given that society is still on a journey of understanding trans youth, there's this fantastic campaign. It's called the We Are Allies campaign. It's weareallies.ca. It's this fantastic national campaign here in Canada and also available elsewhere. Both social media and a website with these beautiful stories where, whether it's parents or family members or people who were more recently trans and non-binary youth, telling their stories about supporting folks, what that looks like, and how important it is to show up for trans, two-spirit, and non-binary youth. There's Indigenous leaders who are stepping up and sending really strong messages that, of course, trans, two-spirit, and non-binary folks have always existed. There's certain things that complicate our ability to access that information, whether colonization or destroying records or whatnot. But of course, always been there. And so just those are important things to go look at, to better understand. There's some research briefs in case you want, a few more stats to fill out your understanding. But it's really important to be able to understand what all is at play so that there's not these kind of cavalier statements like, oh, this is just a trend, or this is something that a trans youth is doing for attention. It just isn't the case. And so it's really important to understand that better. And weareallies.ca is a good place to start with that understanding.
Amazing. Kind of continuing with the idea that a lot of people are seeing being trans as a sort of trend. I wanted to ask about how the narrative around trans people, and especially this idea that it's a trend, and it often comes with an overemphasizing of detransition stories. Can I ask you about that? Like,
Hmm.
do you have any thoughts about that and how that changes or affects public perception?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's an important aspect. So, uh, the concept of regret, right? So that this is a trend that somebody kind of gets caught up in, and then at the end or at some other point, like regrets having done that wasn't the right thing for them, that they misunderstood themselves and were actually are cisgender, right? And so having gone through that process, they now know, and that in of itself, sometimes people are pushing that as a way to say, well, we need to really question, push back on, delay anything for especially trans and non-binary youth, right? So those are almost linked in people's minds because people have regret. Then we shouldn't allow them forward until much later, or this elaborate hoop jumping endeavor shows us otherwise. Um, Now, I will say the detransitioners are a very small percentage of the experiences of gender diversity. So it's about 1% of 1%, right? So it's like very minuscule number of folks detransition. What I will say is it's very complicated. For some, they're actually cisgender and they needed to go through a process to better understand their being cisgender. And for me, that's not a bad thing. Certainly, maybe people didn't wish they had everything. I can appreciate that, and I have a sensitivity towards that.
Hmm.
But I think there is something about going through that process to really understand the depths of one being truly cisgender. Like, that's a good thing in my mind. Of course, I would want to listen to their stories to better understand that rather than putting my own story on them. But I will say another pretty significant portion of that 1% of 1% is actually folks who have such an awful coming out process that they are like, this was way too much. I did not reckon with this much like backlash from, rejection from my family, loss of job, loss of spouse, loss of children, like, you name it. Like, people really go through the ringer and then are like, holy crap, and they backpedal, right? So it
Hmm.
is actually their true identity, but the cost of it was too much for them to bear. And so they actually detransition, not because it's inauthentic, but it's just because they don't want to bear those costs, which I totally appreciate. Like, that's
100%.
uh, I've had a pretty good time of coming out. Some challenges, but I will say, if I had lost everything, I don't know, right? Like, this is
Hmm.
it's just being honest, right? So you just can't know somebody's experience, and it's actually a range of different things. And some people detransition and then retransition back. So it's very kind of dynamic, moving, multiple types of experiences within detransition, and there's no cookie cutter, right? And
Hmm.
so I think it's important. I think really important, what would really help is probably counterintuitive to many folks, is to allow more space to explore. Because then people don't have to put this pressure on themselves to be like, if I tell everyone, I've got to be 100,000% sure. And then there's a huge cost on the back end when actually there was still a little bit for them to explore further, right? Instead, if we had a society where it's just like, hey, these things are coming up for me. I don't know exactly what they mean. I want to explore them a little bit, and this is how I want to explore them. And then family, friends, employers, cool. Let us know what you need, and then going off on their merry way. And then people can kind of pivot in whatever way they need. I just wish it wasn't so rigid. Um, and I think that would help out many people. And I think you would see a detransition rate drop uh, if people had more space.
I actually had a really interesting conversation with my doctor relatively recently about
Oh,
this.
yeah.
In Alberta, I live in Alberta, there are some interesting things going on around trans youth here.
Yes.
And I was talking to my doctor about um, her experiences. She runs a rainbow clinic here in Edmonton, and she was talking about how, because there is this panic of uncertainty and not knowing how things are going to play out, a lot of her patients are
Mm,
suddenly making leaps and asking for interventions when they wouldn't ordinarily be doing
right.
that.
Yeah.
And they don't feel ready to do it, and they wouldn't necessarily even want to do it, but because they are risking a future where there is no option,
Right.
they are now trying to do it as quickly as they possibly can, and that is so heartbreaking. It's the opposite of what we
Mm.
think, that we're sort of funneling people into a decision that they maybe don't want to
Huh.
make. You're going to experience more regret by not allowing people to explore this in their own time and in their own way. You're going to have the exact thing that you're trying to avoid by doing that.
It's bananas. It's so counterintuitive in both directions. The way that you're describing, absolutely, I've heard that as well. People rushing into things when, they're not ready, because of this impending, looming, possible legislative change. And that's also the case in the United States, when really people need time and space to make these very important decisions, whether with themselves, if they're adults, and or if they're youth, to with their family and whatnot. um, there should be time, but unfortunately, if there isn't, then that can drive up the regret rate. And so it's making it more complicated when, if we just like took a deep breath and be like, let's figure this out together. And also, what I don't appreciate sometimes is, the mis and disinformation about, basically a child overnight deciding this is not reality, but thinking on certain sides where wake up one day, go to school and ask for whatever gender affirming procedures and are immediately given them without any sort of parental involvement or doctor involvement. Like that just does not happen. As soon as a youth informs parents, they're involved. They go to doctors. The doctors run so many different tests, even for adults, right? I mean, this does not happen overnight. It is a very protracted experience, and so that is an important thing. It could be a bit shorter, but in my opinion, but just their guardrails already in place that people are just not aware of, don't understand. Maybe they don't want to understand, but this is not something, just does not happen overnight.
Mhm. We sort of joked a little bit at the beginning about you indoctrinating people. And I wanted to ask you about the sort of what are the real factors that come into, or I suppose you can't speak for everybody, but from what you can see and in your own experiences of um, understanding your own gender, what are the things that actually influence that, as opposed to imagining that it's just trans people are in the world and therefore we're all being indoctrinated in that
Right,
way?
right. Yes. I mean, it does start with oneself, right? I mean, that's step number one in most, if not all, trans and non binary experiences is this understanding, in contrast to what is being asked of us, to be like, well, that doesn't quite work. It doesn't fit, right? Whether it's clothing or how one's body develops. It's like, whoa, something's off, or really off. And what helps with that understanding is being able to talk about it openly, with a trusted person. That definitely helped me just to kind of get it off, the chest, literally. Um, um, and to realize, one, they're not alone in this experience, that others also have this. And what really helped me was, I had these kind of notions or feelings or understandings of myself. And it's not until I heard other people describing them that I was like, that's exactly what I'd never been able to put words to it before. And that was a very exciting experience. So definitely meeting with others. For me, somebody who was further along in their journey, to because I had the notion that yes, I'm trans, but it's not worth coming out about.
Mm,
I'll just be quietly trans to myself and maybe a few other folks, but I'm not going to do anything about it, and it's too much. But then I had a friend who was going through the process, and it suddenly broke it down into more manageable pieces to be like, oh, okay, it's not actually as far fetched as I had put it
mhm.
in my own brain, and it was much more manageable to where it was more accessible for me to be like, okay, if I could do this, I could handle it, right?
Yeah.
So definitely having connected to a community, and to be able to talk about it and to be able to share with folks. For me, it was a color coded spreadsheet. Now that's not for everybody, but I had like from least, uh, permanent. So like things I could do right away, that didn't require cost, didn't require intervention, all the way to the most
Mhm.
intervention. And I just went through them one by one and then, filled in how I responded to them. And each step of the way, I was like, this resonates, this resonates. And so, by the 25th item, I was like, all signs point to. And so I was a little bit more, had a methodology. Of course, nobody needs to have that. That's just me being quirky myself.
That's the most you thing I've ever heard of.
You can't take the Kai out of anything. So yeah, that's very me, data oriented. So so that was helpful too, to really have, being assured, right? Because for me, I was trying to figure out, is this a matter of being non-binary, or is this truly, me being a trans man? And so I very much clarified it for myself, while also being able to incorporate aspects of femininity that still persisted, that are authentic to me and are be part of me being a man. But also sharing with others. I was kind of testing out name and pronoun change with a close circle of friends as part of a running club, a queer running club. That was really important. The first time I had people say my name and pronouns back to me,
Yeah, I bet.
oh, that was so cool. I was like, dang, I didn't even know that I needed this. This is the bomb. And then I was like, oh, I didn't stop after that. I
Yeah.
was like, that test is over.
Well, that is my experience with you. You were the first to use my pronouns. We were recording a podcast episode. It was our first ever podcast recording, and so yeah, I had it recorded the moment that you did that for the first time, and you used my pronouns for the first time. And so I had to watch that back as I was editing, which was torturous, but
Wow.
it was like genuinely, I view that as one of the best days of my life, which I
Oh
know
my gosh.
that it seems very dramatic,
No,
but
no,
yeah, it
no.
is the only place that I never really refer to with they them pronouns is at work, and I don't mind that particularly, but yeah, it is great. Like it's the best feeling. And I think what you said about community and kind of meeting people who are further along in their journey is super interesting because it goes to this idea of seeing people in public who are trans and having trans people out in the open, and that's causing all this
Mm,
backlash. But
yeah.
also, it's so important for people to understand
Mm,
themselves. And for me as well, I don't think I would have ever reached
mm,
this point had I not met a non-binary person and gone, "Oh, you
mm.
exist. That must mean I exist."
Yeah.
And then, meeting other
Mm,
trans people along the way as well. But yeah, meeting that particular person was very instrumental in figuring that out. And so, this idea that trans people in public or being open about their experiences is tricking
mm.
people into being trans when actually what it's doing is highlighting something that they didn't maybe
Yeah,
realize, or that is highlighting who they are. It's seeing
yeah,
yourself represented.
absolutely. And a quick test of that is like, I always, not always, but I ask some folks like if they're worried about this, if you see, any sort of queer representation on TV, you don't immediately want to be queer, right?
Right.
Like it's just, but I guess their response to that would be, well, it's feeble-minded folks who are just easily swayed, right? That are falling into, innocently falling into these traps set by folks, right? It's like this insidious nature when that's, I don't know, it's not the case. Like it has to connect internally for it to go anywhere. Because otherwise it's just like kind of an interesting thought at first, but it doesn't persist. It's a flame and then it goes out if it's not authentic. But the persistence and consistency is the marker of true authenticity. It just, and you can't help yourself. You can tamp it down for a bit, but it bubbles up. Like it's not something like
Hmm.
people. Yeah, it's so interesting, but it's hard to explain. But it is very real, and as soon as it is allowed to surface, it is strong, right?
For sure.
Well, this has been a really good conversation unpacking the many dimensions of why trans is not a trend. It is has always been here, will continue to stay into the future, whether or not people choose to recognize it. It's just like no amount of pushing back will ever quiet what is there because it is authenticity. It just can't not exist. And so it will. And, this is not just here in North America. Sometimes people are like, oh, this is like, sometimes people say, oh, this is a white thing, right? Or a Western thing. When in fact, if you just look around the world, there's so many different examples. Of course, we, as, people who are not a part of that community wouldn't, want to explain. We want people who are in those communities to explain, but think about Hirja in India. If you think about Moshe in Mexico, we did talk briefly about Two Spirit folks here. There's a Mahu in Hawaii. We could go on with a very long list around the world, but just inviting folks to further explore those communities as well, because just a rich tapestry as part of the human experience and an important part. Of course, we are speaking mostly here in North America, but it's not exclusive to this area.
Amazing. And where can we find you on social media, Kai?
Ah, yes, the social medias. We've got LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. Uh, I was going to say Blue Notes, Blue Sky. I've got them all jumbled in my head. Threads, TikTok, etc. I'm sure there's a few others there that we're missing, but check us out. We have, every week we're posting quite frequently, all kinds of micro learning opportunities on a variety of different topics related to gender diversity. And yeah, look forward to staying in touch.
Sweet. See you later.
All right, bye for now.